He paid a ridiculous price for an old house in northern Russia. Creaky floors, faded wallpaper, and a silence that pressed harder than the cold. Thomas Wolfe, a former military man, thought he was buying just a roof over his head, a place where he could forget the war and finally find peace. But on the first night, he noticed something strange. One wall in the house was too empty, too heavy, too silent. When Thomas tore off the old Soviet wallpaper, he saw what had been hidden for decades since the USSR era. And in that moment, he understood that this house had never been just a house, it was a repository of truth for which people once disappeared. The cold northern wind spread over the outskirts of Arkhangelsk, pressing fog and the smell of damp wood to the ground. Thomas Wolfe arrived at the house early in the morning, when the sky had not yet decided if today would be day. Snow lay in uneven layers, melted in places, compressed by frost into stony hardness in others. The house stood a little off the road. Old, wooden, with a sagging porch and logs darkened by time. It did not look abandoned, but there was something alarmingly silent about it, as if it had long ago grown unaccustomed to human voices. Thomas was 46. Tall, broad-shouldered, with short-cropped dark hair already streaked with gray. His face was angular, as if chiseled with an axe. Sharp cheekbones, straight nose, a scar near his right eyebrow, a sharp mark he never talked about. His eyes were gray, attentive, accustomed to noticing danger before it appeared. After the war, he spoke little, listened much, and always kept his back straight, as if an order might follow behind it. The house seemed familiar to him, not externally, but in feeling, the same feeling as before a battle when nothing has happened yet, but the body already knows something will go wrong. The cellar was waiting for him inside. Mitty Thompson was a short, elderly woman with a thin figure and stooped shoulders. Her gray hair was neatly gathered in a bun, her skin was pale, almost transparent, with a network of fine wrinkles like a map of lived years. Her eyes were dark, deeply set, restless. She smiled politely, but the smile did not reach her, as in them lived the wariness, habitual, learned over the years. She spoke quietly, as if afraid the house might hear her words. "Are you alone?" she asked, though it was obvious. Thomas nodded. They went into the living room. The room was simple. A wooden table, an old cabinet, a sofa with faded upholstery. Nothing extra, no photographs, no personal items. And one wall completely empty. No pictures, no shelves, no clock, just old wallpaper with a Soviet pattern, faded geometric designs popular decades ago. Thomas noticed that Mary Thompson's gaze kept returning to that wall. Every time she spoke about documents, about the price, about terms, her eyes slipped there for a moment, as if checking if everything was in place. The price was laughable, too low for a house with land, even on the outskirts. No bargaining, no haggling. Mitty did not even try to raise the cost when Thomas cautiously noted that the price might be listed with an error. "I don't need money," she said quickly. "I need the house to pass on." It sounded strange. Not for you to buy, not for someone to live here, but to pass on. Thomas felt something tense inside him, that same chill under the skin, familiar from the front lines, a premonition. Signing the documents took less than an hour. Mary Thompson's hands trembled slightly when she signed. When it was all done, she held the pen for a long time, as if afraid to put the final point. Before leaving, she stopped at the door, turned to Thomas, and for the first time looked straight at him. "This house." She hesitated. "It was never truly mine." Thomas raised an eyebrow, waiting for more. "He just watched over it," she whispered. "Kept it as long as I could." He wanted to ask from whom or from what, but years of service had taught him that sometimes a question is the worst choice. Mitty Thompson left without looking back. In the evening, Thomas stayed in the house alone. He unpacked his few things. A military backpack, a jacket, old boots neatly placed by the door. The house creaked, reacting to his every movement, as if testing the new owner. At night, the wind rose and seeped through the cracks, making the walls quietly groan. Thomas lay on the sofa, not fully undressed, a habit he had not shaken. Sleep did not come. It seemed to him that the air in the living room was denser near that wall. The silence beside it was different. Not empty, but heavy, pressing like before an explosion that has not yet thundered. Thomas got up, approached closer, listened. Nothing. But he knew. If a person feels danger, it means it's already there. He stepped back, sat down again, and for the first time in a long while thought that perhaps he had bought not just a house, but something that had waited too long to be found. If so, what exactly is hidden behind this wall, and why did the previous owner fear leaving it so much? The house accepted Thomas without resistance, but without warmth. It stood in silence like an old sentry accustomed to solitude. Thomas Wolfe woke at dawn, not because he was rested, but because his body no longer knew how to sleep through. The war had ended long ago, but it had not left him. It had just changed form, become quieter, deeper, more insistent. He sat on the edge of the sofa, hands on his knees, and listened to the house as he once listened to the night on the front lines. He was an infantryman. Not a poster hero, not a commander with maps, but one who went first through mud, through snow, through foreign land. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, wars became different. Without clear borders, without clear goals, without grateful returns. Thomas carried from there not medals, but a habit of flinching at sharp sounds and sleeping without removing his shoes. After the mobilization, life crumbled into short segments. He worked as a security guard at a warehouse. Night shifts, cameras, empty corridors. Then as a driver. Lone roads, headlights cutting the darkness. Sometimes he fixed heating in old houses, dirty work, but understandable. None of these lives stuck, none became home. A home, as Thomas believed, is not walls, it's a place where you can leave the past without fearing it will catch up. Without that, a person remains a soldier even in peacetime. Arkhangelsk suited him. Cold, restrained, not asking extra questions. People here did not pry into souls, and that was a rare blessing. His new house stood aside, almost on the edge, where the city ended and the forest began. Thomas hung his few things. A heavy military jacket with worn elbows. Hanging it on a nail, he suddenly stopped. The feeling was strange, inexplicably, as if someone had frozen behind his back. He turned slowly. The empty wall, that one. Nothing, just wallpaper. He smirked at himself. Ghosts are for those with imagination, he thought. But his hand clenched involuntarily. At night, he hardly slept. In the silence, faces surfaced. John, red-haired and loud, the first to die. Alex, silent, disappeared after a raid without a body, without a report. Such deaths leave no traces, only voids. Thomas often thought maybe such people remain between walls, those without graves. Sometimes he caught himself talking aloud. Short phrases, orders, warnings. The house listened silently. On the third day, he went into the yard and noticed a neighbor. A man about 60, stocky, with a short gray beard, in an old padded jacket. His face was rough, withered, but his gaze was sharp, distrustful. He introduced himself simply as Robert. Robert spoke little, as if weighing every word. To a question about the house, he shrugged. It stood empty for a long time. Why? People here don't like to remember. That was all. Robert left, leaving a sense of something unsaid. In the evening, Thomas took out an old army album. The photos were faded, but the faces alive. He looked at them and suddenly understood. They all sought the same, a place to stop. He glanced at the wall again. The thought came unexpectedly. What if the house was such a place for someone before? He ran his palm over the wallpaper. The paper was cold, dense, too dense. Thomas did not tear it off yet. He knew some doors should not be approached in haste. Lying in the dark, he felt for the first time in a long time not fear, but responsibility. If something is really hidden behind this wall, then someone once entrusted their life or memory to the house. And if so, is he ready to learn the truth about those who also had nowhere to return? Morning in the house began the same. With silence too dense for an ordinary morning. Thomas started cleaning, not out of a desire for order, but to occupy his hands. Movement calmed him. He wiped dust, sorted old boards, pulled traces of someone else's life from corners, which seemed to have ended suddenly and without explanation. The house yielded reluctantly, as if resisting the attempt to be brought into the present. Almost immediately, he noticed something odd. All the walls in the living room had once been occupied. On them remained crooked nail marks, darkened circles where clocks, shelves, photographs hung. All except one. That wall was perfectly empty, as if deliberately left untouched. Not a single nail, not a single trace. Thomas stopped opposite it. The wallpaper on the wall was old. A characteristic geometric pattern, faded shades of brown and beige, typical for the late 50s and early 60s. Such he had seen in houses of his childhood, in corridors of state institutions where time had frozen for a decade. He ran his fingers over the surface. The paper was dense, almost too dense. Thomas lightly knocked with his knuckles. The sound was wrong. Not dull like a load-bearing wall, not ringing like a thin partition. It was empty, deep, as if behind the wood hid a space that should not exist. His shoulders tensed instantly. The same sound he had heard many years ago when they dug temporary shelters on foreign soil. Quickly, silently, knowing that if they erred, they would be found first. Then every wrong sound meant death. Thomas stepped back. No, he said quietly to himself. But his body already remembered. He went outside, inhaled the cold air, trying to shake the feeling that the house was watching. Neighboring houses stood at a distance, people were hardly visible. This area seemed to exist outside time. Later, in the store on the corner, he tried to casually start a conversation. The saleswoman, a woman about 50, plump with a tired face and dyed blonde hair, first answered willingly. But as soon as Thomas mentioned the address, she fell silent. That house. She lowered her eyes. Better not to ask. Why? She shrugged. Back then, it was such a time. Better not to know. She said nothing more. In the evening, Thomas found himself opposite the wall again. He listened. The house lived its own life. Cricket, cracklet, reacted to temperature changes. But from behind the wall came other sounds. Barely audible, rhythmic, like slow breathing. He remembered Mary Thompson's words. He just watched over it. Watched why? At night, he could not sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling and counted breaths. Every creak made his muscles tense. At some point, it seemed to him that the wall was responding, that the house was not just keeping silence but waiting. Thomas got up, approached closer, and pressed his ear to the wallpaper. Silence, but not emptiness. It was that same silence he knew from interrogation rooms, from basements without windows, from places where the state preferred conversations not to leak out. The thought came unexpectedly and hit hard. Someone was hidden here. Not things, not documents, people, or what remained of them. Thomas stepped back, his hands trembled, and he did not hide it from himself. He was not afraid of the wall, he was afraid of what it could tell. If behind it there really is emptiness, then it was created deliberately. And if deliberately, then by order or out of fear. In both cases, it was connected not with family, but with power. He sat on the floor, leaning against the opposite wall, and for the first time in a long time felt past and present converge at one point. He understood. This house is no accident, and his choice is not either. The state can order forgetting, but walls do not forget. Thomas knew. Sooner or later, he would touch this wall, not with his hand, but with a decision. And then the silence would end. If the wall was created to hide truth, is Thomas ready to learn what exactly the state ordered to forget? The decision to tear off the wallpaper came to Thomas not suddenly, it matured slowly, like pain that can no longer be endured. He stood before the wall for a long time, almost motionless. In these days, it had become part of his thoughts, his sleep, his breathing. The house seemed to shrink around it, turning everything else into background. Thomas understood. If he does not learn what is hidden behind this silence, it will accompany him to the end of his life. He began carefully, his fingers caught the edges of the wallpaper. The paper resisted, as if clinging to the past. The dried glue from decades ago cracked, peeling in layers. Being the first piece followed the second, the pattern disappeared, revealing thin wooden panels, roughly fitted, as if made in haste. Thomas stopped. This was not factory work, the boards varied in thickness, nails driven unevenly. Someone did this by hand, not a craftsman, but a person for whom it was important to hide, not to build. He knocked on the wood. The same empty sound. Thomas took a crowbar, old, rusty, found in the shed. He inhaled deeply, as if before an assault. One junk. The board gave way. Being it opened a space. A small niche, neatly recessed into the wall so it could not be noticed from outside. Inside les sacks. Old army sacks of dense burlap, faded to dirty green. The ropes tying them were worn, but the knots held firm. That's how those who know the value of order tie them. Thomas knelt. He untied the first sack slowly, almost with respect. Inside. Papers, stacks of neatly folded documents, type written. The paper yellowed, edges crumbling with time. On some pages, stamps were visible. Blurred but recognizable emblems of departments that had long disappeared but left a mark in the country's memory. Thomas felt the cold rise inside him. He flipped through pages. Reports, protocols, lists. The formulations were dry, impersonal, but behind them, fates were guessed. Phrases like "for state security purposes" and "temporarily isolate" repeated again and again. In the second sack were photographs. Black and white, grainy. People sat at this very table in this very room. Men and women of various ages, some in military uniform, some in civilian clothes. Their faces were tense, focused, no one smiled. Thomas recognized the interior. The cabinet, the window corner, even a scratch on the floor. The house was a witness. The third sack was the heaviest. In it lay letters. Without envelopes, without addresses. Sheets written in neat handwriting or hasty lines. Signatures absent, only pseudonyms. Sort, Sarp, North, Sado, Volga. These were not personal letters, these were confessions. People wrote knowing they might never be read. They left words like traces. He hoped someday someone will understand why they risked. Thomas closed his eyes. He felt no joy from the find, no excitement, only weight. He understood. This is not a cache for gain, this was a repository of memory, a last chance for those forced to silence. Sitting on the floor, surrounded by the past, Thomas suddenly felt a strange connection. These people also hid, waited, feared, made choices knowing it could cost their lives, like soldiers. He remembered Mary Thompson. Her gas, her words, "I just watched over it." She was not the owner, she was a guardian. Thomas carefully folded the documents back. He did not read everything at once, it required time and respect. He closed the niche, temporarily covering it with a board. The house became quiet again, but now this silence was different. It no longer pressed, it waited. Thomas understood. A had become part of the chain. And now it depended on him whether these voices would be heard or buried again. If these documents store people's fates, is Thomas ready to learn who they really were and why they disappeared? The house no longer seemed empty to Thomas. It was overflowing with voices that had remained soundless too long. Thomas worked with the documents slowly, almost ritually. He spread papers on the table, sorted photographs, reread lines several times, as if afraid to distort their meaning. These texts did not tolerate haste. They were written by people who understood every word could be the last. From the reports, a picture gradually emerged. This was a group, not an organization in the usual sense, but a circle. Intellectuals, engineers, teachers, frontline veterans. Those who had gone through the war and returned with questions the state did not want to answer. They discussed arrests, disappearances, temporary measures that became permanent. The house served as their meeting place. Here they did not read manifestos or plot conspiracies. Here they spoke in whispers, listened, doubted. On one photograph, Thomas saw a man about 50. Tall, lean, with hollow cheeks and thick eyebrows. He sat a little aside, hands folded on his knees, gaze directed down, not from fear, but from concentration. The inscription on the back was faded but readable. Peter Morrison. In the folder with letters, Thomas found mention of this name. An engineer, a veteran, lost a brother in the camps, after 1968 ceased contact. The same formulation repeated again and again. Without dates, without explanations. Some photographs were underlined with pencil. A light line, almost imperceptible but intentional, like a mark, this person no longer exists. Thomas felt a dull rage rise inside him. He knew this language. The language of reports that turned people into paragraphs. He shifted his gaze to the next stack of documents. Lists, names, patronymics, birth years. And suddenly he froze. The surname was familiar. George Smith. Thomas read it aloud. His voice sounded foreign. Smith was the father of Alex, his comrade in arms, that same one who disappeared after a raid and was later officially declared dead in a factory accident. Back then it seemed strange, but war teaches not to ask extra questions. Now everything fit. George Smith was listed as a participant in discussions. A former officer, after dismissal a worker, prone to doubts, so it was written in the note. Thomas sat. His hands trembled. He understood. Alex did not disappear by chance. His father disappeared earlier. Quietly, without trial, without charges. And the son grew up with this shadow and went to serve the state that had already betrayed him once. In that moment, the past hit especially hard. Thomas remembered Alex. Stocky, with a short beard, always calm, as if he had a reserve of silence inside. He rarely spoke of family. Now it was clear why. In the letters, Thomas found fragments of personal thoughts. If we remain silent, there will be fewer of us than there already are. Truth does not need shouting, it needs a witness. These people were not heroes. They did not seek glory. They simply refused to pretend. Thomas understood. It stands between two generations, those who tried to speak and were erased, and those who fought later without knowing why the country so easily loses its own. The house was no longer a shelter, it became evidence. He now saw why fear haunted Mary Thompson. She lived beside this her whole life, knowing one mistake could make the house a place of disappearance again. Thomas carefully folded the papers. He no longer felt doubts, only heavy clarity. The story did not end in 1968, it just changed form. If these people could not speak, then someone must speak for them. The house endured, and so the truth will endure. If truth survived decades of silence, will Thomas dare to take on its weight? The silence in the house ceased to be empty, it became demanding. Thomas understood this on one of the sleepless nights when he sat at the table surrounded by stacks of documents and felt each line as if looking at him. These papers were no longer the past, they became a question addressed personally to him. As a soldier, he knew the price of orders and silence. As a man, he knew the price of truth. Between these two truths lay a narrow path on which it is easy to stumble. If he keeps the secret, he will be safe. If he speaks, he opens the door to consequences that cannot be calculated. He remembered Mary Thompson. Her stooped shoulders, thin hands that trembled not from age but from habitual fear. The woman lived a life next to what could destroy her if discovered. She was not a participant, she was a guardian by force, a watchman of silence. Thomas understood. She did not choose this role, time chose it for her. At night, footsteps seemed to him quiet, cautious, as if people moved trying not to give themselves away. He heard whispers. Fragments of phrases, breathing behind walls. These were not ghosts, this was memory seeking an outlet. He got up, walked the rooms, checked windows, doors, a soldier's habit. The house remained motionless, but Thomas knew. Even if walls are silent, they remember. One morning, he made a decision. He took out an old laptop, bought still for work, and began retyping the documents. Slowly, attentively, adding notes in the margins. He checked dates, sought context, recorded possible explanations, not for sensation, for accuracy. History does not forgive inaccuracies. Thomas understood. If truth is distorted, it becomes a weapon in others' hands. He had no right to allow that. His task was not to accuse, but to witness. The work stretched over days. He hardly left the house, ate little, slept even less. But for the first time in many years, he felt not fatigue, but purpose. He realized. If he remains silent, he becomes the next link in the chain of forgetting, not from malice, from weakness. And that frightened more than any threats. One evening, he sat opposite the empty wall again. It no longer seemed hostile, rather, expectant. Thomas quietly said, "You understand." And in that moment, he felt a strange calm, that same one that comes before battle when the decision is made and there is no way back. This was not a war with weapons, this was a war with shadow. Thomas knew. He cannot save those who disappeared, but he can return their names. And sometimes that is enough for death to cease being final. He carefully folded copies of the documents, labeled folders, added his own notes. He prepared for the next step, not yet knowing exactly what it would be, but knowing what. The house plunged into silence again, but now this silence was consent. If truth is ready to be heard, to whom will Thomas dare to entrust it? St. Petersburg met Thomas with gray sky and damp wind from the Neva. The city always knew how to speak of the past without extra words. He entered the university building early in the morning. Corridors were high, walls light, footsteps sounded dull. Here they did not hurry, here they knew how to listen. Thomas carried neatly packed folders. Copies, originals, notice, everything he had collected, everything he had no right to lose. It was received by Elizabeth Falcon, a woman about 50. Slender, with short dark hair and a calm, attentive gaze. She was a historian, a specialist in the late Soviet period. She spoke quietly but confidently, as if every word had already been tested by time. In her manner, there was no sensationalism, only respect for facts. Thomas told simply, without embellishments. About the house, the wall, the documents, the letters without addresses. Elizabeth Falcon listened without interrupting, sometimes making notes. When he finished, a pause hung in the office, that same one in which it is decided whether truth will be heard. "We will accept the materials," she said finally, but only with one condition. Context, without tearing out, without distortions. Thomas nodded. That was exactly why he had come. Signing took time. Papers passed from hand to hand. But Thomas felt he was losing nothing, he was returning. When he stepped out onto the street, the rain had stopped. The city breathed calmly, like a person who knows the past does not disappear, but one can live with it honestly. The house in Archangelsk he decided to leave as it was. No repairs, no alterations. The empty wall in its place, the niche closed but not forgotten. This was not stubbornness, but a choice. The house should not become a museum, it should remain a witness. Neighbors got used to it, no one asked. Robert sometimes nodded from afar. Short, manly. Nothing more was needed. Thomas continued to live there. Cooked, fixed, went to work. But now the house did not press, it stood beside like an old comrade who had been through too much and finally could silence peacefully. At night, there were no more footsteps, no whispers, only wind. Ordinary, northern, honest. Thomas slept deeper than ever after the war. Sometimes he approached the wall and laid his palm on it, not for checking, for farewell. He knew. Memory does not leave when opened, it ceases to be a ghost. Thomas understood a simple thing. Pain does not disappear if buried, it disappears when called by name. One evening, he sat on the porch, snow fell slowly, covering the ground. The house stood quietly. Not hiding, not calling. Thomas felt what he had not felt for many years, peace. It was no longer a soldier without return, he was a man who had arrived. The house became not a grave, it became a voice. Sometimes we think miracles are something loud. Light from heaven, voices, signs. But more often, God speaks to us quietly. Through an old house, through forgotten letters, through truth someone must dare to hear. Memory is not a curse, it is a gift, even if it hurts. God does not erase the past, he gives us strength to heal it by calling things by their names. And perhaps the greatest miracle in our life is the moment when we stop running from truth and begin to live with it honestly. If this story resonated in your heart, share it with those who may need it. Write in the comments what you felt. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new stories about faith, memory, and hope. May God bless you in your home, and may truth, even difficult, always lead you to the light. Amen.